Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andre Miles, along with Mr. Jeremy Davis, and we are the founders of the Take a Stand movement. And today's talk is called, briefly speaking, the global economic crisis, and I quote. So since we've been away from each other for a little bit because of the holidays, let's play catch up, shall we? So briefly speaking, we are at the crossroads of the most serious economic crisis in world history. The economic crisis has by no means reached its climax, as some economists have predicted. The crisis is deepening with the risk of seriously disrupting the structures of international trade and investment. Briefly speaking, and I quote, I sincerely believe that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, end quote. U.S. President Thomas Jefferson in his letter to John Taylor on May 1816. So we have to understand that America is dying. It is self-destructing and bringing the rest of the world down with it. Often referred to as a subprime mortgage collapse, this obfuscates the real reason by associating tangible, useless, failed mortgages. At least something real can be blamed for the carnage. Okay, the banking industry renamed insurance betting guarantees as credit default swaps, and risky gambling wagers were called derivatives. Financial managers and banking executives were selling the ultimate con to the entire world, akin to the snake oil salesman from the 18th century, but this time in suits and ties. And so by October 2008, it was a quadrillion-dollar industry that few could understand. Propped up by false hope, America is now falling, y'all, like a house of cards. Briefly speaking, and I quote, but you may ask, won't the powers that be step into the breach again and abort the crisis before it gets a chance to run its course? Yes, certainly. That by now is standard operating procedure, and it cannot be excluded that it will succeed in the same ambiguous sense that it did after the 1987 stock market crash. If so, we will have the whole process to go through again on a more elevated and more precarious level. But sooner or later, next time or further down the road, it will not succeed. We will then be in a new situation as unprecedented as the conditions from which it will have emerged. End quote. Harry Madoff and Paul Sweezy, 1988. Briefly speaking, all the idols of capitalism over the past 3 decades crashed. The assumptions and presumptions, paradigm and prognosis of indefinite progress under liberal free market capitalism have been tested and have failed. We are living the end of an entire epoch. Experts everywhere witness the collapse of the U.S. and world financial system, the absence of credit for trade, and the lack of financing for investment. A world depression in which upward of a quarter of the world's labor force will be unemployed is looming. Briefly speaking, so let me ask a question, and that is there an alternative to plundering the earth? Is there an alternative to making war? Is there an alternative to destroying the planet? See, no one asks these questions because they seem ludicrous, yet no one can escape them either. Until the onslaught of the global economic crisis, the motto of so-called neoliberalism, as TINA, which stands for there is no alternative. No alternative to neoliberal globalization, no alternative to the unfettered free market economy. Briefly speaking, when the reality of the economic crisis first emerged, many who realized what was happening dubbed it, and I quote, the Great Depression, end quote. This description was more than bombast. It was a sober analysis of the immensity of the economic problems in the country, problems that had been building up for years. Briefly speaking, humanity is undergoing in the post-Cold War era an economic and social crisis of unprecedented scale, leading to the rapid impoverishment of large sectors of the world's population. National economies are collapsing and unemployment is rampant. Local level famines have erupted in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and parts of Latin America. This globalization of poverty, which has largely reserved the achievements of post-war decolonization, was initiated in the Third World, coinciding with the debt crisis of the early 1980s and the imposition of the IMF's deadly economic reforms. Briefly speaking, economic conquest is an integral part of America's adventure. The U.S. military and intelligence apparatus consults with Wall Street and Texas oil giants. Conversely, the IMF and the World Bank, which have a mandate to supervise macroeconomic reform in developing countries are in communication with the U.S. State Department and the Pentagon. Economic warfare supports Washington's military roadmap. We are looking at an integrated process involving conquest through outright military operations and theater wars, on the one hand, and the destabilization and conquest of sovereign countries through other means on the other. Briefly speaking, large amounts of surplus dollars are pouring into the rest of the world. Central banks have recycled these dollar inflows toward the purchase of the U.S. Treasury bonds, which serve to finance the federal U.S. budget deficit. Underlying this process is the military character of the U.S. payments deficit and the domestic federal budget deficit. Strange as it may seem, and irrational as it would be in a more logical system of world diplomacy, the dollar glut is what finances America's global military buildup. It forces foreign central banks, to bear the cost of America's expanding military empire. Effective taxation without representation. Briefly speaking, the bailout measures of late 2008 may have consequences at least as grave for open society as the response to 9/11 in 2001. Many members of Congress felt coerced at the time into voting against their inclinations, and the normal procedures for orderly consideration of a bill were dispensed with. The excuse for bypassing normal legislative procedures was the existence of an emergency, but one of the most reprehensible features of the legislation that allowed Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson to permit bailed out institutions to use public money for exorbitant salaries and bonuses was inserted by Paulson after the immediate crisis had passed. Even more reprehensible is the fact that after the bailouts, Paulson and the Treasury Department refused to provide details of the Troubled Assets Release Program, TARP, spending of hundreds of billions of dollars, while the New York Federal Reserve refused to provide information about its own bailout using government-backed loans that amounted to trillions. This lack of transparency was challenged by Fox TV in an FOIA suit against the Treasury Department and a suit by Bloomberg News against the Fed. The financial bailout legislation of September 2008 was only passed after members of both congressional houses were warned that failure to act would threaten civil unrest and the imposition of martial law. Briefly speaking, Continuity of Operations Program, COOP, the Army's new role in 2001, not protecting American society, but controlling it. Hold on. Let me say that again, just in case you didn't hear me, okay? The Army's role in 2001, not protecting American society, but controlling it. This new role for the Army is not wholly unprecedented. The U.S. military have been training troops and police in civil disturbance planning for the last 3 decades. The Master Plan Department of Defense Civil Disturbance Plan 55-2 Operation Garden Plot was developed in 1968 in response to the major protest and disturbance of the 1960s. But on January 19, 2001, on the last day of the Clinton administration, U.S. Army proclaimed a new and permanent Continuity of Operations program. It encapsulated its difference from the preceding externally oriented Army Survival, Recovery, and Reconstitution system as follows. In 1985, the Chief of Staff of the Army established the Army Survival, Recovery, and Reconstitution system to ensure the continuity of essential Army missions and function. ASRRS doctrine was forced primarily on a response to the worst-case 1980s threat of a mass nuclear laydown on Kunduz as a result of a confrontation with the Soviet Union. The end of the Cold War and the breakup of former Soviet Union significantly reduced the probability of a major nuclear attack on CONUS, but the probability of other threats has increased. Army organizations must be prepared for any contingency with a potential for interruption of normal operations. Briefly speaking, the intensive quiet preparations for martial law in late September 2008 at the height of the financial meltdown, the Army Times announced the redeployment of an active brigade Army team from Iraq to America in a new mission that may become a permanent part of the active Army. The 3rd Infantry Division, 1st Brigade Combat Team, has spent 35 of the last 60 months in Iraq patrolling in Battle Rattle, helping restore essential services and escorting supply convoys. Now, their training for the same mission with a twist at home. Beginning October 1st, for 12 months, the 1st BCT will be under the day-to-day control of the U.S. Army North, the Army Service component of Northern Command, as an on-call federal response force for natural or man-made emergencies and disasters, including terrorist attacks. After 1st BCT finishes its dwell-time mission, expectations are that another as yet unnamed active duty brigade will take over, and that the mission will be a permanent one. They may be called upon to help with civil unrest and crowd control. Briefly speaking, as the global economic crisis deepens, ongoing efforts by the defense and secretary establishment to shore up the empire's crumbling edifice consumes an ever greater proportion of America's national budget. As much as 36%, according to some estimates. Briefly speaking, capitalism has always changed and morphed. It has adapted to changes in the world and has forced the world to adapt to its changes. Capitalism has never and never will be entirely consistent in its structure and institutions. The global economic crisis has sped up developments that have been underway for a long time, specifically within the last century. In the midst of a global crisis, these changes, which have been slow and evolutionary, are being rapidly sped up and accelerated. Briefly speaking, to understand the historical context of the current crisis, it is pivotal to address the nature of the most vital and powerful force within the capitalist global political economy, the central banking system. One of the least understood, most widely ignored, and mysteries of capitalism, the central banking system is also the source of the greatest wealth and power, essentially managing capitalism, controlling the credit and debt of both government and industry. Any nation of a, and I quote, free market, end quote, must be dispelled in its true meaning, for as long as central banking system has been dominant, central bankers have managed and controlled capitalism for the benefit of the few and at the expense of the many. Comprehending the nature of central banking is necessary in order to understand the nature of the current economic crisis. Briefly speaking, and I quote, by acting together to fulfill these pledges, we will bring the world economy out of recession and prevent a crisis like this from recurring in the future. We are committed to take all necessary actions to restore the normal flow of credit through the financial system and ensure the soundness of systematically important institutions, implementing our policies in line with the agreed G20 framework for restoring lending and repairing the financial sector. We have agreed to the support of general SDR allocation, which will inject $250 billion into the world economy and increase global liquidity. G20. Common UQ, London, April 2nd, 2009, end quote. Briefly speaking, real economic democracy, defined as unfettered opportunity for every person to achieve his or her productive potential and be fairly rewarded for doing so, does not exist on earth today. The economic life of the world today is based on predatory capitalism, where the people with the most money are the ones in charge. Briefly speaking, when the smartest guys in the room designed their credit default swaps, they forgot to ask one thing. What if the parties on the other side of the debt or the bet don't have the money to put up? Briefly speaking, is it possible to make hundreds of billions of dollars in profits on securities that are backed by nothing more than cyber entries into a loan book? It is not only possible, it has been done. And now those who cashed in on the swindle have lined up outside the Federal Reserve building to trade their garbage paper for billions of dollars of taxpayer-funded loans. Where is the justice? Where's the justice in that? Meanwhile, the credit bust has left the financial system in shambles and driven the economy into the ground like a tent stake. Please, we ask that you take just a second to let all that has been said sink in. Let it get past your surface thinking and allow it to get deep into the core of you. Play it again if need be. We need you to get involved. And with that, I digress. I say thank you for your time and attention. I love you all in Yahshua. Continue blessings. The Take a Stand movement.